This is what he has to prove. And he cannot do that. These are the three statements. And I know you may be thinking to yourself, wait a second, don't we have to decide if Mr. Depp committed abuse? And the answer is no, you don't have to. Because these three statements, you can decide as a matter of law, or as a matter of fact, as you weigh the evidence and the facts, that they're true. So the first two statements I'm going to address together. Then, 2 years ago, I became a public figure representing domestic abuse, and I felt the full force of our culture's wrath for women who speak out. Number two, I had the rare vantage point of seeing in real time how institutions protect men accused of abuse. When you go back to the jury room to deliberate, you should feel free, like I said, to read the article and think of the article's purpose. The jury instructions also tell you to take these statements in the context of the article. Think about the purpose. The purpose of the article was to promote legislative measures designed to protect victims of domestic abuse, designed to protect people who did exactly what Ms. Heard did, to speak out. That's apparent on the face of the article. And to do that, Ms. Heard talked about her own life experiences as someone who had obtained a TRO against Mr. Depp, someone who had accused Mr. Depp of domestic violence. Make no mistake, and Mr. Depp's side keeps trying to say that we're somehow suggesting that 2 years before she wrote this, that Ms. Heard hadn't had anything to do with Mr. Depp. We're not saying that. You heard Ms. Heard herself say, of course, 2 years before I wrote this article, I felt the full force of our culture's wrath for women who speak out after she obtained a temporary restraining order against Mr. Depp, after she became a public figure representing domestic abuse. But the words that she wrote here, and then chronicling her own experience after that, those words are true. Those words are true. Similarly, the rare vantage point of seeing, based on her own experiences post May 27th, 2016, how institutions protect men accused of abuse, those words are true, and the First Amendment protects Ms. Heard's right to say them. Now, the third statement is absolutely true as well, but we're going to take that separately because she didn't write it. Under the First Amendment, the statements have to be false in order for Mr. Depp to win. Now, plaintiff addresses, like I said, an argument that we're not making. And as I said, we're not running from the fact that when she discussed becoming a public figure representing domestic abuse, Amber was speaking of her experiences reporting domestic abuse against Johnny Depp. She admitted to that, but that doesn't make the article or the statements about Johnny Depp. Think about it. Think about every piece of evidence that you've heard over the last 6 weeks about his abuse, about their relationship. None of that is in the article. None of it. We all know that it would be a very different article if she had written about what she suffered, that she's told you about over the last 6 weeks. Because he knows the words are true, Mr. Depp says that the words now have a defamatory implication. He says the statements are the same as saying, Johnny Depp abused me. But just because he wants to make the article about himself doesn't mean it is. He has to show you that any defamatory implication was designed and intended. Look at number 4. Designed and intended by Ms. Heard to convey the defamatory meaning that he suggests. Just because people might read the article and remember, oh yeah, Amber Heard used to be married to Johnny Depp and she accused him of abuse, that doesn't mean that she designed and intended defamatory implications in writing about herself. And think about it. If Mr. Depp is right, then virtually any statement that anyone could ever make about their own life that implies anything, implies any involvement with any other person, could be defamatory. And that's clearly not what the First Amendment intends. She didn't design and intend the words to be the equivalent of writing Johnny Depp abused me. And you don't have to take her words for it. You can take the words of Terrence Doherty of the ACLU. He said that the op-ed wasn't even Ms. Heard's idea. The ACLU wrote the first draft, and great care was taken in drafting the article so as not to make it about Mr. Depp or Ms. Heard's relationship with him. That's the only evidence presented about Ms. Heard's motive, except her statements that was exactly what she wanted to do. She wanted to talk about her experiences after Johnny Depp. She wanted to own her story after Johnny Depp and fit those into what other women experience, what other people experience having accused someone of domestic abuse and the backlash that they suffer, and then talk about legislative measures that could help protect people in those positions. That's what she meant, and that's what the article is about. There's no hidden meaning here, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't a hit piece on Johnny Depp. This isn't a hit piece on Johnny Depp. And you can end here. You can end there by saying the statements that she wrote were not false and the First Amendment protects them. Let's talk about the headline for a minute. The headline that was published in the online version only of the article on December 18th, 2018 said, "I spoke up against sexual violence and faced our culture's wrath." A few points here. Number one, and this evidence is undisputed. There's no dispute about this. So as you weigh the evidence, you don't have to check your common sense at the door, and you can weigh circumstantial evidence, you can weigh facts, but you can't see evidence where no evidence exists. And the undisputed evidence here is that Ms. Heard didn't write the headline, she didn't approve the headline, she had nothing to do with it, she was not given notice of the headline. She testified, you saw her testify about the sexual assault that she experienced at the hands of Mr. Depp. You saw her testify about that. But they're calling her a liar. You saw her on the stand testify with your own mouth, with her own mouth, exactly what she went through for the first time in court, because people who have suffered that, they don't want to broadcast that to the world. They want to penalize Ms. Heard for not speaking about that earlier. That's ridiculous, and it's insulting, and it's just victim blaming at its most disgusting. The only reference to sexual assault in the article, and you can read the op-ed, is sexual assault that she said she had experienced by the time she was of college age, before Mr. Depp. So there is a reference to sexual violence in that article, but it's not by Mr. Depp. And Mr. Depp can't hold her liable for a headline she didn't write, that contained something that had nothing, that was not about him. And they want you to think that she republished the headline by tweeting out the link to the online version. So let's look at this. This is the tweet that she sent on December 19th. The hyperlink says, "Opinion Amber Heard, I spoke up against sexual violence." That's the online version of the article. As Ms. Heard said, you can't tweet a piece of paper. So when she wanted to share that she had written this article, what choice does she have? She has to attach that link. And the jury instructions that you have make clear that a hyperlink is not republication. Forwarding a link on does not mean that you broadcast the statement again, but that's what they want to make you think. The only way, and the jury instructions that you have, and we don't need to read through them in detail now, but the republication instruction says that merely linking to an article does not amount to republication, but adding content to a linked article may constitute republication. You must determine whether any added content was intended to reach a new audience, and if you find any content added to the hyperlink was intended to reach a new audience, it constitutes a republication. There was no content added to the article. She tweeted above the article simply saying, "Today I published this." That's what she said. She didn't add any content to it. She could have added some of the content that you've heard in this courtroom to it. She could have said, not only did 2 years ago I become a public figure representing domestic abuse, but let me tell you about the domestic abuse that I suffered. That would be adding new content. This is not adding new content. But I guess it's no surprise, because this whole case is about blaming Amber Heard for things she didn't do. But that's what Mr. Depp does. It's what he's always done. Blame other people, refuse to take accountability. But the problem for him here is that he's running headlong into the United States Constitution, which says that you cannot hold Amber Heard liable for words she didn't write or publish. But here we are. Here we are. And you can decide this case without ever wading into any of the allegations, the facts, the evidence that you've heard about the heinous abuse that Ms. Heard suffered at the hands of Mr. Depp. You can decide that by determining that those statements are true and that they're protected by the First Amendment. But Mr. Depp brought this case, and he's suggesting that he was never abusive to Ms. Heard. So if that's where you want to make your decision, that's where the road ends for Mr. Depp. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be very clear. If Amber was abused by Mr. Depp even one time, then she wins. One time. And we're not just talking about physical abuse. We're talking about emotional abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse. That's what we're talking about. Let's look at the evidence. You heard Mr. Depp define abuse from his own mouth. He admitted all of that when he talked about his childhood. As they reference, his mother called him one-eyed because he had a lazy eye. And he said that that was worse than the beatings that he took. Worse than the beatings that he took. Being called one-eyed by his mother was worse than the beatings that he took. And after the evidence that you've seen, some of which you're going to see, I want you to think to yourself, is being called one-eye worse than what he did to Miss Heard? Absolutely not. You'll remember his expert, Shannon Curry, agreed with all that abuse can take many forms. And you'll remember that Don Hughes, Miss Heard's expert, talked about the reports of intimate partner violence by Miss Heard, characterized by physical violence, psychological aggression, sexual violence, coercive control, and surveillance behaviors. She tested Miss Heard. She said that the tests show that there's a high degree of serious violence perpetrated by Mr. Depp toward Miss Heard. She got that opinion and that impression by reviewing the medical records of Miss Heard. She talked about the role of coercive control that Mr. Depp exercised over Miss Heard. The effect of coercive control, she said, was drastic, and it was composed of things such as possessive jealousy, the imbalance of power, not only in physical stature and physical size, but in where they were in their life and their career, by intimidation. She said writing obscene messages to your partner can absolutely be intimidating behavior. She said that Mr. Depp, after reviewing the evidence, banging and throwing and hitting things in the household, that's psychological aggression. Punching a wall, throwing something, screaming, that is abuse. That's abuse, ladies and gentlemen. She said alcohol can just throw lighter fluid off a flame in a situation of domestic violence. All of these things constitute the domestic violence that Miss Heard suffered at the hands of Mr. Depp. And he's trying to get you, to fool you, to believing that he's carried his burden of proof that never a single time in their relationship was he in any way, physically or non-physically, abusive to Miss Heard. And that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. So let's look at some of that evidence. And like I said, you can apply your own common sense. You don't need to check that at the door when you go into the deliberation room. I'm going to walk you through the evidence, some of the evidence that's been presented, including evidence from Mr. Depp's own mouth, his own words or the words of his witnesses. Keep in mind the burden of proof. And as we go through this evidence, I'd ask you to keep this in mind as well. It's not about who's the better spouse. It's not about whether you think Miss Heard may have been abusive to Mr. Depp. It's not. Because remember, if you think that they were both abusive to each other, and that's what their witness Laurel Anderson testified to, then Amber wins. They're trying to trick you into thinking that Amber has to be perfect in order to win, even while they're ignoring Mr. Depp's many flaws. But don't fall for that trick. Amber's not perfect. None of us are. She's never pretended to be, and that's not what you're being asked to decide. One time, ladies and gentlemen, one time. If he abused her one time, Amber wins. Actually, if he fails to prove that he never abused her one time, Amber wins. So let's take a look at some of the evidence. This was one of the first messages shown to Mr. Depp in his cross-examination. This is a message to Paul Bettany, his drug buddy, early on in their relationship, when he says, "Let's burn Amber. Let's drown her before we burn her.